Hello and welcome to another episode of All Politics is Local. All Politics is Local is a production of the Greater Blackstone Valley Democrats. For more information about the Greater Blackstone Valley Dems, feel free to visit our website at www.gbvdems.org. We have yet another great show planned for you tonight. With me in the studio is Max Morringello of the Massachusetts Voters for Legislative Reform. Max, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. I'm glad that you could be here tonight. Let's just dive right into the topic. Tell me, what is the Massachusetts Voters for Legislative Reform all about? What's the idea? Go for it.
Absolutely. Well, one of the issues that I've been passionate for a long time is sort of the amount of power, how power is sort of structured in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. Right now, we have the Speaker of the House who sort of has a lot of say as to what bills pass and what bills don't. He has a lot of influence as to who gets to be on what committee. And so, people don't really have a lot of freedom to voice their opinion publicly on certain bills or, on certain issues regarding the speakership because of that. And I think that, if you look at the Democratic Party platform that was just recently adopted, it says that every legislator should have an equal voice in the legislative process. That's not verbatim, but basically it says that to that effect. And, I think that, we live in a democracy and we believe in the ideals of democracy. And it might not be the most efficient form of government, but I think that having a more democratic process in the House would sort of, result in better legislative outcomes in terms of representing sort of the will of the chamber. I think there's certain instances that you could point to where that hasn't been the case. I think one of the biggest things I know, Milford, you've been personally involved in was the casino issue.
Right, yeah, we were very involved in the casino issue. Foxwoods Casino tried to, or Foxwoods from Connecticut, that is, tried to put a casino in here. And we were very involved and very vocal about keeping that from happening in this town. And
what happened was, under Sal DeMacy, he was opposed to casinos. And then, he was no longer speaker after he had gotten into some trouble. And then, DeLeo became speaker, and he supported casinos. He's from Winthrop, and he grew up in Revere, which has the Suffolk Downs. And what happened was you saw 64 representatives switch their votes from an anti-casino stance to a pro-casino stance. And I think a lot of people feel that that was because of the speaker sort of influencing people. It was
maybe more or less strong-arming people into changing their vote.
And I think that's kind of the biggest example. There are some other things too that I think have been concerning. We saw a bill with called regard to net metering, which is with regards to solar and how much energy, how much money they could get from to the for the grid for solar.
Sure, I work in the solar power industry, so believe me, that's a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and I was really distressed with what the House did with that bill.
So I think what happened was that leadership was pushing sort of put forward this bill. They sort of told legislators we'll work towards something better, but just pass this for now. And then what happened was it wasn't clear that was going to happen, and we had over 100 representatives actually sign a letter to the conference committee saying, we actually support the Senate bill. We don't support our own bill that passed our own chamber.
Okay.
And so I think what happened there is, one of the problems when you centralize power in the hands of leadership is, all leadership, all lobbyists have to do to sort of influence legislation is just target those people in power. And then have to target all the other reps. They could just target, the speaker and the Ways and Means chair and get their agenda. And I think that's sort of the progressive case for it is, sort of the progressive case for this issue is that, if you want to reduce the influence of lobbyists and sort of special interests, you can't. You got to sort of decentralize things, so there's not that sort of an easy target.
Sure. Now let's just give my viewers just a little bit of background on the State House. In the State House, there's 160 representatives, correct, and 40 senators.
Right.
Okay. So here in Milford, this is our Senate district. What we have here on the map that's behind me here, we have 15 towns that make up our Senate district. And that's the Worcester 10th or Worcester and Norfolk 10th.
I'm not sure what the number is.
I believe it's Worcester and Norfolk because a couple of those towns, Bellingham is in Norfolk County. Be that as it may, we have the 40 Senate districts around the state. Within our district here, though, there's like 4 state representative seats.
I know Medway is kind of a piece of Medway.
A piece of Medway is in with Milford and Hopedale and Mendon. Bellingham is in a different Senate representative district. There's at least 4, maybe even 5 pieces they cross the state Senate boundaries as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're not, we are focused on the House mostly. I think in the Senate, there's been this model of shared leadership under Stan Rosenberg. And I think part of that, a lot of senators have responded very well to that. And it's a little bit different. There's a different dynamic in the Senate because you've got 40 leadership positions, 40 senators, where in the House you have to you have 160 people and more like 40 leadership positions.
Sure.
So there's more competition for that. And so there's more of a dynamic for that sort of power structure. And I think if you compare it to other states, and even the federal level, you'll see that there's more of that dynamic when you have more members.
Mm-hmm.
I think what we're concerned about in the Senate is just making sure that the rules are codified, so that we want to make sure that the rules are codified, so that Stan Rosenberg has a good leadership model, but we want to make sure that it's written down, so that future leaders are incentivized to follow sort of the same process.
Sure.
I think in the House, I think we want to put. Our sort of goal is, well, first, we want to have a conversation with leadership. They might not listen,
Mm-hmm.
Especially, I think they sort of were very upset with the article that we put forward, that was in the State House News. But, we were going to make we were willing to have a dialogue, but then also sort of, I think, work with state reps. And, I think this is an issue that many of them don't talk about. They can't, because if they do, sort of a repercussion for talking about that.
Sure, because again, the power is centralized,
Right.
and you certainly don't want to jeopardize what power you do have. If we could talk a little bit about that State House News article, Brett, if you don't mind, bring up max001.jpg, because I did get a screen capture. There we are, State House News, focusing on DeLeo, Franklin activist, hopes
Actually,
to stir Dems and report it. Sorry?
I don't have a subscription to that. I actually saw it in the Milford Daily News, where it was republished, but I actually never actually got to see the
rest of the story.
Rest of the story.
So this made it out to State House News, and then from there to Politico. You've really made some waves.
Yes.
So congratulations. That's awesome. Now to make some impact.
Right.
Waves are one thing, but the impact is quite another.
And I think that's sort of implanting this issue in reps' minds. If they do sort of have an opinion on this issue, that even if they can't talk about it, there will be a time when you have another leadership election. Might not be immediate, but we're sort of want to build sort of a grassroots campaign to sort of remind our reps that this is an issue, so that when leadership elections do come around, that they sort of say, hey, we want someone who's going to be, empower the rank and file, maybe implement some of the reforms that we proposed, including, I talk about sort of the committee process and how that's a big influence for people. Well, one way to change that is to change how committees are assigned.
Mm-hmm.
So we have, there's not all different states do it differently. One state that I sort of point out in the article is Nebraska. They have a committee on committees that's sort of elected by the body as a whole that makes the committee assignments. In Nebraska, chairmanships are actually elected by the floor. That might be a little bit much. South Carolina has a thing where the committees select their own chairs.
Okay.
So, just removing that power, it doesn't matter how it's done, as long as you sort of remove that power from the speaker and place it in some other form, that's what, that's sort of the important thing.
Mm-hmm. Now, another thing that happens with committees frequently on Beacon Hill is that's where legislation goes to die.
Right.
Do you have any proposals around those lines? Because I really don't like to see good bills just not being acted on.
Well, I think the biggest thing is when it's voted on without sort of, not in a transparent way. I mean, it's one thing committees are, they should make recommendations. When it's sent to study, it's not really sent to study. It's just, there's no study that actually happens when you send a bill to study.
Sure, it's sent to a quick death.
Right, and so what happens is they have a study order, and so they have all these bills listed together, and it's just a single vote to kill all those bills at once. And so, I think personally they should have to vote on each of the bills up or down. Mm-hmm. You don't have to do it in person. You could do it via email if it's easier. But as long as you're on the record, at each individual bill, that makes sense. And the other thing too is I question how much of the committee actually has input into that study order, what bills are on it, and how much of the decision is the chair, and how much of direction of that is actually coming from the speaker's office. Mm-hmm. I can't say it's the speaker saying what bills are going to be getting to study, but that's why we need more transparency and
right.
people on the record as supporting certain bills.
Right, and we also have an issue around roll call votes because those don't
right.
happen very often. Most of the business that's done on Beacon Hill is done by voice vote.
Correct? Right. I think that part of the issue is also that, and this sort of I don't know how this ties with the power thing, but Speaker Leo sort of wants to build consensus around issues before bringing them to the floor, and he wants to make sure that he has a sort of a desire to protect his members, and that's where he gets a lot of the buy-in for sort of the power, is that if people don't want to be on the record taking risky votes. I think you see that with sort of the SAFE, not the SAFE, Secure Communities Act.
Yep.
I think there's a lot of people who don't want to be on the record either way because it's a controversial issue, and I think this leadership views their role as sort of protecting their membership, because they to view elections and that to win elections, and that might not necessarily that might be good for them, but in terms of the public knowing where their representatives stand, that's sort of more of a challenge. And I think consensus sort of there's a place for that, but it doesn't. It's not just consensus in the House, in the chamber. It's consensus with all the interest groups. I think, when we had sort of the gun reform, the gun safety issue, he brought everyone to the table, and it's good to have input. But I think when the effect of that is that it sort of blunts sort of the legislation, so that's like the bare minimal that could possibly pass. And I think that's what you see a lot of frustration from progressives on, is that because there's sort of this consensus, the only thing that comes out of the House is things that have support of everyone, and that tends to be not what progressives want.
Right. It tends to be watered down, or not quite what we should see in such a democratic state where the legislature is clearly dominated by Democrats. What's the ratio right now? It's about 80% Democratic control. Right.
And I think I do have to caution. I can't say that having. First off, I want to say that the speakership. It's not just about having. We don't want to. Some people have master lists. They sort of accused us of saying we just want a progressive in there who's going to do the same thing as Leo, but just in a progressive way, and that's not what we're advocating. We believe that whoever the speaker is, they should be someone who's going to be a reformer and sort of decentralize sort of the power structure. It doesn't matter if it shouldn't matter what their viewpoints is. They should be a facilitator, a neutral facilitator. It doesn't.
Sure, we'd get better legislative outcomes
Right.
if we just had more input and more power for the members.
Yeah. But to sort of go off that, I think a lot of, you shouldn't. I think that the chamber is a conservative chamber. Even if you sort of have a decentralized system, it's not necessarily going to produce progressive outcomes. And I think what progressives, if they they care about these issues, have to do is work on sort of educating the electorate as to promote progressive issues and getting more progressives elected. 54% of the House has a more conservative voting record than the Speaker does, and that's Progressive Mass scorecard if you want to look that up. So I think that we think things should be more democratic, but that doesn't necessarily mean everything's going to be all progressive and better.
Right. So where do we go from here? What are you really proposing for reform? What kind of reforms do you want to see?
Well, I think like I said, part of that was sort of I think encouraging our reps to support leadership. I think we have to have it organized on the grassroots level. We're starting to do that in our first meeting in Milford at the Milford Town Library.
Okay. And that's coming up on October the 7th?
Yes,
okay.
At 1 p.m. It's in the Granite Room, and you could RSVP at mareform.com. You just always get a sense as to how many people to expect, and we want to get a group of people and then sort of branch out to other parts of the state and sort of work on a grassroots level to sort of work with our reps and talk about this issue and address this issue. And I found there's a lot of Democrats who care about this issue, and everything to I say that, but we also need if we want to elect a reformer as a speaker when the time comes, we also need to we had a Speaker Kavarian, George Kavarian in 1985 became speaker as a reformer. He became speaker with the Republican votes and Democratic votes. So you're really going to need sort of everyone on board because that sort of the incentive to sort of to not do it is there's a lot of things at play there.
Sure. And how would you go about making this a permanent change if we can't?
So I think we want someone to change the rules in the House, but as we said, we had term limits for the Speaker, and then they just changed the rules to get rid of them. I think in the long term, if we want things to be permanent, we would have to push for a constitutional amendment to sort of either have term limits for the speaker or as well as some of the other sort of changes we're proposing. And that's an even bigger uphill battle because depending on how it's done, if it's proposed by us, if we proposed it and the House wasn't on board, we would need the entire Senate and the House GOP. And the governor, if they don't, we need all these people on board to sort of pass a constitutional amendment. It's a lot of work if it's a voter initiated.
Mm-hmm.
But if we get a progressive speaker, it could be something that the chamber passes itself.
Mm-hmm.
But that would be more durable than simple rules reform in each of the chambers.
Sure, and I think that's what's most important is that whatever reform we get out of this, we'd like it to be durable. We'd like it to last. And that way have a lasting impact, and certainly try to get us some more and better progressive legislation. There's a lot of things that we need in this state. Same-day voter registration is something that we need. I can't believe Massachusetts doesn't have that. We've been leading this country since before it was a country, and yet other states have same-day voter registration, and we don't.
Right.
There's so many areas where we could be doing better.
Absolutely, and it's just. I think we just got to improve the process, and I think if we do that, the people, the ideas that sort of have the most support will sort of come to the top. I think one of the things that the Senate has been good about is they've been empowering their steering committee, to sort of advise sort of the Senate president as to what issues are most passionate about. And I think with the House, I called their office and they said, we haven't met once during this session.
Okay. Yep.
So, I think there's a difference between how they sort of use those positions.
Sure.
Also,
the Senate has a stronger progressive caucus, don't they? Percentage-wise, I believe there's about 9 or 10 senators in the progressive caucus, which makes up 20 to 25% of the senators.
Right.
So it's a little easier for them to push for progressive reforms.
And it's interesting why that is. I speculate. There's some ideas I have as to why that could be part of it. Is that first off, the Senate has more staff, so they're sort of able to. I think with the House people in the House, you see a lot of focus on constituent services, which is important, but it sort of diverts attention away from some of the big statewide issues that progressives care about. They can't focus as much of their time on that, and then the chairman of the House chairman sort of take more of a role in that. And then the other thing too is I think you see a lot of folks from the House sort of have more experience in town government, and I think part of that is there's a lot of experience there in town government, and it's good, but I think that it's not necessarily the most progressive stepping stone.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that you always see sort of local aid is always the biggest issue, and
Sure.
It's an important issue, but it's not. It sort of crowds out all the other priorities because you see all that sort of not necessarily earmarks, but sort of local priorities, and it sort of crowds out sort of the statewide priorities.
Sure. There should be quite a few statewide priority for us. So.
Yeah, I'm passionate about a lot of things. I'm a progressive, but yeah, I think being able to focus on those issues, it just hasn't been happening as much as we'd like. So.
Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit more. We've got a couple of other issues here. How about the amendment process? So you say here, non-transparent consolidated amendment process.
Yes. So right now, during the when we have a budget, the House they have like thousands of amendments, and they can't vote on all of them. So what they do is they go behind closed doors and they say, okay, we'll replace all those amendments with this text. And this text doesn't necessarily include all the text of the amendments that they replace. So, you could have an amendment for single-payer health care. Well, it could be bundled into a consolidated amendment, but the consolidated amendment doesn't actually say anything about single-payer health care. And so they put that to the floor, and they vote on it, and then, when it passes, all the previous amendments are effectively dead. So there's some other ways to do it. The Senate, what they do is they sort of group all the amendments together into sort of yes or no piles, and then they vote on them. That might, you have more amendments in the House to do that, but another option could be sort of having sort of the House and the Ways and Means sort of make a recommendation as to what, amendments in each category ought to pass and ought not to pass. And actually include the text of those amendments. So if they make a recommendation that this ought to pass, it's actually included.
Mm-hmm.
And that people are on the record as to voting for this package of amendments, and that rather than sort of it being bundled and sort of not there being a record of people voting one way or the other on it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not very clear. I'm sorry if I could make that clearer, but
That's okay. It's not transparent in the first place, so it's kind of hard to make
Yeah.
it clear, right? I mean,
but there's different ways to do it. I don't think it's feasible to vote on every single amendment. I credit that.
yeah, you have to have some give and take somewhere.
Right.
Yeah.
And I also think, one of the things I want to talk about is that, I don't want to make this about the speaker personally. I think that it's about the position of it's about the office, and I think it's, no matter who's the speaker, I think this is an issue we've got to tackle. I as much as, I disagree with him on certain issues, I think, he's a good worker. He's, if everyone, whenever I ask a state rep, or ask, someone, they think the speaker has too much power, they'll pivot and say, oh, well, he's a really nice guy. And he is. But, I think that doesn't sort of, you can still be a nice guy and still kind of use your power a certain way.
Sure, and it certainly doesn't excuse the issue.
Right.
You also look at it from a standpoint of, the speaker does have a lot of power. How many prior speakers, how many of the last, 3 speakers have ended up in jail?
The 3 prior.
Yeah.
The one before that was Speaker Kavarian, who reformed the system, and then gradually it kind of eroded back. So, like I said, that's why it needs to be durable. You got to have the rules reform. We also got, you got to look at the Constitution too, because I think that's the most way, the biggest way it's going to be durable, and that's, I think just having that discussion is important.
Right. Well, you mentioned though that the constitutional amendment requires an awful lot of work. What was it? 65,000.
Well, there's 2 ways. You could either do the signatures, or you could actually have the legislature propose an amendment, which doesn't require the signatures, but then you would need the speaker and the Senate president on board.
And for the legislature to propose an amendment, doesn't it require 25% in 2 consecutive
that's if
legislative
it's that's if the voter approves propose
Okay,
it.
okay.
If they propose it itself, so it requires a majority.
Okay.
So I think we're playing the long game. So it's going to be a long process, but I think just the fact that we're putting it out there, we're getting people's attention. And the other thing I want to add too is, one of the common arguments I hear about this is, by bringing up this issue, you're hurting Democrats, and I don't, and that you're going to be helping the Republicans. And I think that, just because if someone's a Democrat and they do something that you disagree with, I don't think that should prohibit you from, calling them out on that.
Sure, of course not.
And I hear that argument a lot, that we're helping the Republicans, and I think there's a lot of, people in Beacon Hill are very fearful about the elections, even though they have a majority, a supermajority. I think that there's a lot of people, especially with Fiscal Alliance,
Sure.
and I think that sort of plays into this idea that we got to sort of, be in solidarity and not sort of speak out on this issue. And I think that, but I think that if Democrats were to take the lead on this issue, then it wouldn't be it wouldn't be a Republican issue.
Right. And one of the things that I've seen with the Mass Fiscal Alliance, I think that their target is to just get themselves to the point where they can sustain a veto. That's what they want.
Right.
They want to get enough of enough representatives to be able to sustain a veto from a Republican governor, and they often end up with Republican governors. So that's their aim right now.
Right. And I'm not saying it's irrational or that it's wrong to sort of that case, doesn't have merit. But I don't think that should preclude us from sort of addressing this issue.
Sure.
And I think the alternative, I don't think, I'm not saying, go elect a Republican in response to this issue. I'm saying elect a progressive reformer in response. If you're progressive, elect a progressive reformer who's going to address this issue. And, it's hard to sort of speak out while, the speakership happens, but I think, when people are going to start coming around asking for votes, and this should be on people's minds, and that's when people have more of an opportunity to sort of make a decision. And that's the other one thing too is, as you see sort of people sort of, I think part of the speakership too is, you also want people want to be on a winning team, so they get the chairmanships and that kind of thing. And that's part of it, is convincing people, don't go for the chairmanship, go for sort of someone who wants to empower everyone.
Right.
And I think if we can do that, I think that'd be a big difference.
Yeah.
So I think, I've said, I think one of the most awkward questions you could ask state rep, I think this for most state reps, some will say, disagree with me and say that, the speaker doesn't have too much power, but for most of them, they can't answer the question, because they feel that, if they were to answer it, they could get in trouble. But
Right.
if they were if they were to be, if they were, or they could be dishonest and say, oh,
They could dodge the question.
dodge
sure.
the question.
Yeah.
And so, I think, I've asked a few people, and it's just the reaction is kind of immediate as to how sort of how, because, they need the speaker in order to pass those bills. And so, this is a toxic issue. And, I'm not entangled in too many other things, so I'm kind of able to take it on. I'm still a little worried about, the things I do work on being affected by it. And, so it's very, very tough to take on. And I think, we'd like to have support from other organizations, but because of sort of the sort of toxicity of the issue, we can't count on any other party support.
So your meeting on the 7th, that's to begin the process?
Right, yeah. So, we want to get enough people together, figure out a game plan going forward, how to organize, maybe figure out if we could meet with leadership. That might not happen, but we could sort of talk about trying to approach that subject. And I think maybe sort of on the Senate stuff, we might be able to meet with leadership there on that issue. And, sort of how we organize, if we get enough people, if we get enough people going in different parts of the state, eventually talk about incorporating. We can't spend any money unless we incorporate, because we don't have a budget, unless we get, in-kind donations or anything.
Right, you'd have to at least register with the OCPF as a political organization or something.
Right, well, I think since we're not involved in campaigns, I don't, that's not the plan as of yet. I think a 501c4.
Okay.
But that, there's filing fees, there's all these different offices you got to file, and it's a lot of work. But if we had enough committed people, we could keep the momentum going, and that's the goal of this meeting, is just to get enough interested people into a room, talk about the issue, and work on it, and sort of figure out a game plan and how to build momentum going forward.
Okay.
So thank you so much for hearing what I have to say tonight. I think that we have sort of a big issue, and I think a lot of people sort of have been affected by sort of the impact that sort of the speaker has over the process, and sort of the legislation that people want hasn't been realized currently because of sort of the amount of power that the speaker has. And I think that trying to decentralize things and sort of give everyone an equal say will sort of make things more democratic. And we're as Americans, we believe in the premise of democracy. And I think that by coming together, if this is an issue you're passionate about, I think this is something we could work towards and sort of make a big difference. So thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, Max. Thanks for being here. We really appreciate you taking the time, and good luck with all your efforts here. I hope everything works out for you.
Thank you so much.
You've been watching All Politics is Local. All Politics is Local is a production of the Greater Blackstone Valley Democrats. For more information about the Greater Blackstone Valley Dems, feel free to visit our website at www.gbvdems.org. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Good night.